Okay, so there's lots of maritime disputes in the South China Sea. The Philippines, for example, brought a case to the International Court of Justice in The Hague, and this international court ruled in Philippines' favor. China has largely ignored the rulings, so just remember that we live in a system of anarchy. We do have international rules and courts, but ultimately, if powerful countries don't agree with these rules and verdicts, there's not much that international institutions can do. So there's all of these maritime disputes, and this is causing tension within Asia because basically China is rising as a global superpower, and a lot of these countries are quite concerned about China becoming much more powerful and using that power to harm the security of these countries. The short term to medium term aim and objective for China is to remove the US influence from this first island chain. So basically, China would have control over this entire sea. The core objective, I would say, apart from having control over the sea, is ensuring that if China were to take control of Taiwan, the US Navy and US planes would not be able to access and defend Taiwan. The long term objective is to extend its sphere of influence to the second island chain, and the US could only operate in the Pacific Ocean, but and not the Philippine Sea or the East China Sea or the South China Sea. So it's about extending China's influence over these seas. Okay, so this is an example of them building islands and militarizing them, and this is an example of the cabbage strategy. Now, another concern that China has is it really relies on this sea route, but this sea route poses a really big problem because it's basically a choke point. This is a really narrow passage of water, and it's only 2 miles wide, and these countries traditionally have been quite sympathetic to the United States. Now, things are changing a little bit, but if the United States wanted to, it could really damage China's economic interests by doing this. They could actually block China's access through this narrow passage of water called the Malacca Straits. China would not be able to get through it because basically these ships could just close off that narrow passage of water, which at its shortest is only 2 miles wide. So it's really a vulnerable point for China. Now, one of the solutions to the problem of the Malacca Strait is the Belt and Road Initiative. As I said before, this is more its economic strategy to win influence in Asia, but also in the Middle East, Africa, and Europe. It is a huge infrastructure project. China is building roads, rail networks, ports, and fiber optic cables across the continents, and it's connecting these markets to Chinese markets. So it's connecting China to the world's islands. It's enhancing China's influence and geopolitical influence over Eurasia, the Middle East, and Africa, as China makes significant financial and economic investments in these countries. Part of the strategy is influence, that China will increase its influence over global commerce. This will, like, by investing in these countries, it has more of a influence over the rules of commerce, um, information sways, commercial standards, and finance. So China can formulate the rules of commerce within these markets, as well as creating courts that can arbitrate disputes that these countries might have. So it's really about using its military power on this side and then its economic power on this side. Now, is the Chinese investment through the Belt and Road Initiative working? In ways, it is. I mean, if you look at the countries in red, these countries are shifting towards China and away from America, which has been the traditional superpower within Asia and the Pacific. Countries like Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal, Cambodia, Laos, through China investing in these countries, they're developing deeper connections with China as opposed to the US. What's even probably more concerning for the US is that traditional allies to the United States are now playing both sides. They're not strongly committed to the US. In ways, they're kind of looking for China for economic investments and then maybe using the threat that they will join China to get more concessions out of the United States. Maybe the US will increase the security in this country and pay for it. Now, even though many countries are shifting towards China, there is concern and reservations about China becoming much more powerful, and its power could lead to domination within the region. An example of this is, their very aggressive tactics in the South China Sea. So I think a pretty accurate statement of geopolitics in Asia at the moment is many Southeast Asian nations still concerned about Chinese dominance in the region. They look to the US for security and China for trade. A further objective of the Belt and Road Initiative is to stabilize its western border. As we've spoken about, its western flank is quite vulnerable. It's full of allies to the US. So it really wants to be able to have a stable and friendly western border. And it is concerned that if these regions become unstable, that these will be sources for Islamic extremism and terrorism that could then support extremists within Xinjiang that challenge the territorial integrity of China, that there will be more terrorist attacks within Xinjiang. So the basic strategy is if we just give these regions more money, they'll become friendlier to the heartland of China, and there'll be less potential and possibility for terrorism and extremism and violence against the Chinese states. So it's really trying to connect these areas, build them up economically, and connect them to the Chinese economy. But as we said before, Xinjiang is still a problem. Like, it's still a volatile region. China needs to adopt draconian surveillance policies to control the population, like these education camps, facial recognition software, using artificial intelligence to control the population. A further controversial element of Chinese foreign policy is the use of the Belt and Road Initiative and how it may lead to a form of debt trap diplomacy. That a lot of these countries that surround China that are receiving significant investments and Chinese workers building ports and roads and rail networks and infrastructure in these countries is that they cannot pay back the loans. And a good example of this is Sri Lanka received loans from China. Chinese workers came to Sri Lanka. They built a port here. And then Sri Lanka could not pay back the loan. And then as part of the terms of the conditions of, if this country could not pay back the loan, China took control of the ports. And now it can just militarize this port and it has more influence over the Indian Ocean. So the terms of these loans often are balanced in favor of China. And China can then gain hard power, so like military strength in this area, and poor countries risk high debts. So the Belt and Road Initiative helps enhance hard power. As you can see, China is building like naval ports where they can actually put weapons, put their military and navy in them, and they can have greater and more secure control over the Indian Ocean, which is a really important ocean for China to access these markets. It also means that China is less dependent on the Malacca Straits. So instead of ships coming through here, which is a choke points, the China can trade here and here. So the ships can come up here, and then they can make their way across these friendly Chinese nations right into China. So that's pretty much it. So what I'd like you to do now is look at Moodle, find the Chinese or the China revision quiz, attempt the quiz, and see how you get on.
Do you and your team need to work remotely?